Hey folks, I'm glad to be here. And guess what? I'm here again to talk about MCP and security. And I'm not alone this time. I have Nate and Wils from Arcade.dev. Welcome folks, so glad to have you here. Well, for what it's worth today, we're going to be talking about MCP security. And for the conversation that we have today, there's a big question that's looming over everybody's head, and that is, how do we make sure that we build servers that are actually production ready? Because we know that production ready is hard, and we know that security is hard. And because security is something that we should not build ourselves from scratch every single time, there's folks that are building those tools. And like Nate and Wils here are the ones that are building these out. So we're going to be talking about how do we make sure that our MCP servers, the tooling that we're constructing, and that every single piece of that infrastructure is actually ready and is enabled for all sorts of governance controls, for all sorts of authentication and authorization controls. And that is especially critical because now we're seeing a lot of the adoption of MCP in agentic workflows. That is, if I have a coding agent, if I have an agent that is responsible for sending email, or if I have maybe an agent that is responsible for building out other tools for me on my behalf, it's not as simple as just me throwing in a token or throwing in an API key and saying, go and work on my behalf. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And especially when we see the evolution that right now is happening in the MCP specification, and that is we see changes in the authorization flows, we see changes with the enterprise profile that's coming soon, we see a lot of changes to how incremental auth works. All of these pieces are going to be highly relevant to agentic workflows, and specifically for MCP servers that are designed around interacting autonomously without user interaction. So that there's some very interesting problems, and I'm going to check in with our tech team to see if we have Nate and Wils yet. I'll keep going. All right, so let me just walk you through some of the things that we are thinking about at a very high level. So one of the most important pieces with the MCP security right now is, as I mentioned, authorization. We talked about this yesterday with Aaron and Darren, Aaron from Okta and Darren from AWS. And as enterprises start adopting MCP, and we see a lot of this adoption happening today, one of the core pieces that they're always asking is, how do we establish those proper governance controls, those proper channels by which we can monitor which MCP servers can actually be enabled in my organization? How do I make sure that the credentials that are used by those MCP servers are not leaked and are stored securely? How do we make sure that servers that are acting autonomously, as I just called out, are actually acting on behalf of users with the proper security controls and with the right set of changes that enable them to not necessarily be overprivileged, right? Because that's kind of one of the perpetual issues, that your servers do way too many things that you cannot necessarily do yourself, because that's the nature of the API. For MCP in this context, because MCPs, and if we think about like the types of servers that we have, right? We have local, we have remote. If you think about the threat model is pretty much the same as you have seen before, right? If you have a local MCP server that is essentially running on your box, it has the permissions of the user on the box. That means that it gets access to everything that that user has access to. If you have a remote server that is sitting somewhere behind a firewall like any other API, it's just an API. But the difference here is that MCP servers can now be used by agents. And agents can act on behalf of a user. So this is somebody like me, I'm kicking off a coding task, I'm kicking off some process, and I just send off my agent and say, here, go and access my source code and do something with it. Go and invoke a bunch of tools to rewrite my code base and add some new library dependencies. Deploy this to prod, which can be a very scary scenario. But in this scenario, it's important to make sure that whoever is managing my organization actually has both the visibility in knowing that I'm the one that invoked the agent, I'm the one that triggered the MCP server, right? And I'm also the one that is able to control how that activity goes back and forth, and seeing like what is actually going wrong, what is going right. So all this being said, again, we are having our experts here in this remote studio. So we're gonna bring in Nate and Wils again. Hello, folks. How are you? Are you ready to be talking about production-ready MCP and agentic workflows?
So ready?
We are ready.
Absolutely. All right. So I've been rambling about all security, and I've been doing the security stuff for some time, but maybe let's start with kind of the big picture. Why is authentication and authorization such an important topic and such an important problem to be solved when we are moving into this era where MCP servers can now be used by agents and agentic workflows? Maybe I'll hand it off to Nate.
I think that's a great question. Thank you, Dan. It's really more important than ever because in the past, maybe we had web services, or you mentioned APIs, web applications where, it's important to log a user in. It's important to make sure that your account can be accessed by somebody else. But in some of those cases, the stakes were pretty low. If somebody logged into my Amazon account, I mean, maybe they could buy something for me and I have something weird show up at my doorstep. But in the grand scheme of things, maybe not the worst thing in the world. I could charge it back on my credit card, or I could cancel the order or something. But when we move into this world where we have dozens, hundreds, or maybe even thousands of agents working in an organization, maybe doing things totally on their own, it becomes incredibly important to make sure that the controls are in place and to make sure that the authentication, that the agent is who they say they are, or the user is who they say they are, plus the authorization of, okay, maybe we know who you are, but what are you actually allowed to do? What is the agent allowed to do that might be the same or different than the human is allowed to do? Do we want to give the agent a policy to say, oh, maybe we trust the human to delete the prod database, or maybe not. But for an example, maybe we trust the human to make database changes in prod, but we don't trust agents to do that. Those kind of granular authorization decisions are, I think, more important than ever.
Right, and because we are talking about MCP and authorization, and we talk about the MCP specification, and a lot of that really focuses on user interaction, right? Like if we look at the core scenarios that exist today, it's all about the user went, provided their credentials, the user went and logged in, they gave permissions with standard OAuth flow. Like none of this is new, right? It has existed for some time. But once we start deploying production-ready MCP servers, and especially MCP servers that start working autonomously, a lot of these flows no longer apply. They don't work as well, right? Because like if you have an autonomous agent, you can't quite have a user logging in because there is no user. The user just sent some command that the agent needs to go and execute the task. So how do we rationalize that in the world of MCP? Like what are the things that folks building MCP servers should consider when they get into this kind of workflow where there is no user in the loop per se to do a lot of these auth pieces? And Wils, maybe you can share your opinion on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to remember, and kind of referencing yesterday's chat that you did in the studio with Aaron and Darren, there will be different scenarios here. There will be some times when the user is present, they're chatting in VS Code, they're chatting in a web app on a CLI, something. But as you said, there will be scenarios where the user is not there. The agent is acting on their behalf in some autonomous way. Maybe they got a webhook from some system. Maybe they did something else. But I think it is also important to remember that there will have been some consent at some point in the past, like whether that's the user saying like, yes, I give you permission to work autonomously in the future on my behalf. That's a very normal OAuth flow that happens all the time. Or maybe in some enterprise scenario, it's an IT admin saying like, I'm going to set this up on the behalf of the organization to run anytime we get a sales call that comes in and a recording, and I'm going to analyze it on the behalf of the organization. So I think the thing to remember for developers is to remember the scenarios that you're targeting and in a particular time, but also keep open and keep in mind that people may want to use your code and your products in ways that you didn't expect. And I think that's one of the things that MCP does really well. It's trying to nail all of those types of scenarios, but it's also very difficult to like work in that scope of could be anything, could be any time. So
right.
And I'll add to that the what's kind of new or a new thing that server developers need to think about if you're building an MCP server versus building like a web API server or something is it tends to be the case that the cardinality of the authorizations that you might have to keep track of is much higher than it's been in the past. Maybe not obvious at first, but in the past, you might have to track, like Will said, whether this particular user consented to this thing at some time in the past. But now, with a especially with like a multi-tenant, multi-user MCP server, you're tracking that certainly, but you're also tracking potentially like the user times the agent times the type of consent, the scopes required. So the cardinality of it tends to be quite a bit higher, at least from what I've seen.
And that actually sounds kind of scary to me a little bit, right? Because you can have an agent that is connected to a myriad of services, right? I might have an agent that is connected to, like I said, I have my shopping cart for shopping, and then maybe I have an agent that is connected to a service that reads my email and organizes my calendar. But also agents can interact with each other, right? So you can have the agent that is, I don't know, responding to my email, which I don't have it yet. I wish I did. But maybe it would look at my calendar and start coordinating meetings. And at the same time, like the permissions are quite different, but they somehow need to interact with each other. And from what you just said, it sounds like I can just say, oh, I'm just going to log into the agent with my credentials that give it access to everything, because that just doesn't work. Then we're over permissioning them. They're doing way too much.
Yeah, that's an anti-pattern that I've seen a lot, and it makes sense why people do this. But there's an anti-pattern in agent development right now where people say, "Well, I don't yet know all the stuff my agent is going to be able to do, or maybe what I want it to be able to do in the future. So I'm just going to give it, a personal access token, or I'm going to give it like a super user token, admin key, or something like that." That works, on my machine, so to speak, for me, and maybe okay if you're just building something for like a personal agent for your own personal use. But as soon as you want to get to production, like we're discussing here, you have to definitely not a good idea to use things like a personal access token or a super user admin credential for exactly the reason that you just said. You don't want the agent itself to be over provisioned. Certainly not more provisioned than the user is. And most of the time, you want the agent to be a little bit less provisioned than the user is. Because, like, maybe I'm okay with the agent reading my email, but I don't want it to go like delete my email or like delete an entire calendar. Um, so I think that's a very important distinction between kind of the like playing around with stuff on my machine versus a production agent, that it really bears repeating. The over provisioning of agents is exactly where we get some of the kind of headline grabbing posts we see on X or Blue Sky or LinkedIn, where people are like, "Oh no, I this coding agent was so cool until it deleted like all my code, or it erased the production database or something." And the problem is not like we can improve models and make sure that models get smarter, but ultimately it just shouldn't have been able to even have the key to do that in the first place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I certainly wouldn't trust a human to delete my production database, let alone an agent. So
Yeah.
that being said, you did allude to something that is the topic of the conversation, which is production ready agents, production ready MCP servers. And for those scenarios, there's certain things that are best practices, like you said, like don't hard code secrets, don't use like access tokens that are hard to rotate and rogue. What other things should folks be thinking about when they're deploying production ready, agentic ready MCP servers?
I think there's a lot of things. As we all know from going, it works on my machine to how do I make it work for more than one user? And I think that's a big key step that we at Arcade are focused on, is how do I go from works on my machine to now it can work for not just my company but other companies, not just my friends, but ideally the world, or whoever. And again, that's not everyone's scenario. So maybe production for you is runs on my machine. It's only ever going to be in my home lab or whatever, and like that's fine. But I think we're focused on, in this conversation, how do I take it to work across lots of users, either at your company or across companies. And for those cases, like we said, not hard coding secrets, using correct authorization and authentication practices. It's going to be talking about like an enterprise use case. It's going to be integrating with IDPs that enterprises already have in place. It's going to be making sure that you're hooking into any entitlements or kind of governance systems that already exist in those enterprises. So there's lots of pieces that come into play on the security sphere. But then there's also like scalability concerns, and how do I is this one MCP server that I'm running can I scale up and handle the load across the 10,000 customers that I have, or however many it ends up being. How is it going to be able to connect to the database that I'm trying to connect to? If I have like 50 servers that spin up, is that database going to be okay? So it's like all these kind of systems conversations you have to keep in place. There's testing and continuous integration types of scenarios that you have to start thinking about. So there's lots of these pieces that kind of get added on to how do I make this thing reliable, scalable, secure, that again are not necessarily new to us as software engineers, but are becoming increasingly new in this world of MCP and agents.
I would add something I think that I'm excited to see baked into the protocol now. I think something the protocol has gotten really right so far, is thanks to you actually, Dan, is the codifying OAuth 2.1 as kind of a base requirement for the protocol itself. That it ties exactly into what Wils is saying. There's kind of a set of security principles that we've known for a long time in the web that have been floating around, that like the best services implement these already. So it's nothing new. But taking that as a baseline, like the starting point for MCP, rather than kind of a lofty goal or the stretch goal for MCP, but just saying, you know what, if you're building an MCP client and an MCP server, you have to start with OAuth 2.1 as a baseline. I think that is a really important step for the protocol to make, and we see that now in the June 18 release of the MCP protocol, or the version. Um, the the question from there is, of course, how do we make sure that developers can do that correctly? It's one thing to have it in the protocol and say, yeah, everything has to be OAuth 2.1, but then making sure that our like starter kits and the MCPs documentation and examples and stuff all kind of make it super easy to build those kind of baseline compliant services, I think is a work in progress, but we're seeing a lot of really exciting progress in that field, just like making it so that developers can fall into the pit of success, so to speak, and make sure that it's easy to do it the right way and hopefully hard to do it the wrong way.
Fall into the pit of success. I love that. I think that should be basically the theme of a lot of the MCP work that, and you folks have been, you're not giving yourselves enough credit. I think like Nate and Wils, both of you were contributors to a lot of the auth space. So we're very lucky to be working with you and the MCP community. I am curious about something. This is that Wils alluded to, is that a lot of the challenges, a lot of the problems that we experience now in terms of securing the MCP servers and securing the infrastructure are not actually new problems. Like, they have existed for a while, right? Like, we all know things like, you have to have a load balancer in front of your API if you want to make sure it doesn't go down when you have a spike of users. You want to make sure you're protecting your database, that nobody can just write it with no permissions. But for a lot of these pieces, when we put it into the world of MCP, wiring them up together is a little bit complicated, because folks are, by their nature, like, not everybody's a security expert. Not everybody wants to be a security expert, for good reason, because security is hard. So what we see emerge now, and this is where I'm curious to get your take on, is this pattern of MCP gateways. We see more services kind of crop up. We're saying like, look, we're going to take all of this responsibility for authentication, authorization, and we'll manage it for you on this gateway layer. You're going to have some compute layer behind the scenes that, of course, is your MCP server code running. It can be written in anything. It can be C#, can be Rust, can be Python, anything, really. But there's a gateway in front of it that essentially handles a lot of these core pieces that are hard to implement. So where do you see this going, and why is this pattern important?
I think that's exactly the trend that I'm seeing as well. I think it makes perfect sense when you look at, history does not repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme often, and this rhymes very strongly with what happened in the cloud era. API gateways emerged as a piece of tech that made it really easy to say, okay, we have these internal components or microservices, or we have an existing API. It is not yet, internet scale. It's not ready to be, exposed to the public internet. But the delta between getting it ready to expose to the public internet is a bunch of like really deep niche security or infrastructure stuff that like most teams just don't have on staff. If you have that on staff, like, consider yourself lucky. That's great. Some people have those skills because you've, fought in the trenches before of like infrastructure stuff, but most teams don't. And it makes sense as we kind of like further specialize the field. It makes sense that there's like purpose-built solutions that wrap up all of the best practices, wrap up the auth stuff, the security stuff, the entitlements and permission stuff, and the scale stuff, and package it all together and say, okay, this is your kind of front-facing front door. Here's your internet layer or gateway layer, and behind the scenes, like you said, maybe that's just some Python code that's actually running the tools or the retrieving the resources, or maybe it's a mixture of like some C# here, some Go here, some Python over here. Being able to abstract those concerns and say like my gateway concerns are handled by like a reusable component, and it plugs into my existing infrastructure. That's really helps teams get a lot better like time to market, being able to see the results, see the value out of this stuff more quickly. And it also means that you have a much, I think, smoother path to retrofitting old systems. So it doesn't have to be like a total big bang rewrite. It can be, you can take it in pieces and say, well, we're going to expose a little bit of functionality here. Doesn't mean we have to like rewrite our entire internal system in like Python or something. We can just take a little bit of our API, expose it via an MCP gateway or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what term is going to really emerge as like the term for that, but I think MCP gateway is maybe the leading contender. That I think it provides teams a way to start dip their toe in the water and say, we're going to do this the right way, but we also don't have like 6 months to build this in-house.
Wils, what do you think?
I agree with a lot of what Nate said. I think that history rhyming is definitely I'd agree with. There's a lot of similar patterns here of this is middleware. This is a hard thing to think about, much less to build. And developers at the end of the day, they want to be. I would actually argue they don't even really want to be building MCP servers. They want to be building tools. They want to be building like experiences. And so MCP is a means to an end, is my kind of hot take for this conference, I guess. But I think there will be a lot of pieces that get kind of pulled out of what a developer has to worry about building. Auth, scale, all these things are some of that. And I would reiterate, like we've seen this pattern before. We've like Nate mentioned, API gateways are a thing, were a thing in the cloud era. However, I would say there's a difference here, and we started to see it kind of with authorization in the cloud era, where authorization was and is much more tied to the business logic of the thing that you're trying to do. So it was very hard for these gateways to pull out the authorization piece into some externalized system. And I think we'll continue to see things like that in MCP and in agents and agentic AI world, where it's not exactly obvious yet, like where those and how those things will get pulled out. So I think we'll see something similar in that middleware will be a thing, but whether it's a gateway or something more complicated and closer to your app, your agent, I think is yet to be seen.
Love it. Focusing on the customer value, because at the end of the day, it's all that matters is shipping actual implementation to customers that solves real problems instead of focusing on kind of the plumbing, if you will. Now, we might have some community questions, so I want to hand it off to our good friends, James and Burke, who are sitting right behind me.
Whoa, we're right here.
Yeah.
And you're there.
What questions do they have?
Oh my God. Everyone is really loving this specific topic. People are just infatuated with different security and best practices going on, beast practices, if you will, beast mode practices. So I think what's really fascinating here is we need all of y'all back to do more content over here on the channel for us, which would be super rad to see. So lots of great questions from the chat. What's the first one that we got, Burke?
We got one over when you start here. Yeah, this is a good one. So Abe says, one of my tool requirements, Atlassian OAuth 2 token, and we would like to use Microsoft Intra AD as an authorization server. How can we do it?
They can do this today. We have guidance, and lucky for you, we actually have Julia here, who's going to be presenting shortly in the Azure API management space that enables a lot of these scenarios. So as we talked with just Nate and Wils just now, we're heavily invested in making sure this gateway patterns is the reality where we can make it very easy for you to just adopt cloud solutions, plug things in, plug your compute in, and just run with it. That's the answer.
Wow, that's amazing. That's actually a pretty good segue. Y'all can't see Julia, but she's just right here off camera.
Hey, Julia.
She's right here. Hi, Julia. All right. What do we got over here? Yeah, why don't you do
This is more of a statement, but we can get your thoughts on it, which says, servers should never trust token data blindly, always validate signature, audience in general, AUD.
I think, Nate Wils, what do you think? What should servers be doing with tokens these days?
Vibes. Yes. Check the signature, check the audience, do all the things. There's lots of libraries that will help you do this. Again, like we're saying, this is complicated. This is esoteric sometimes. Use SDKs and libraries that will help you do this the right way, so you don't have to worry about it.
I will also say one of the parts of MCP or integration problems that I think has been the hardest to explain and definitely the hardest to kind of grok, because I see people asking questions about this all the time in the community, is that in MCP, the word token is like horribly overloaded now because it means like 1,000 different things. But in this case, for MCP specifically, MCP has authentication or authorization tokens between the MCP client and the MCP server, and that's one thing. And then there also might be authorization tokens between the MCP server and some other API, like Atlassian in the previous question. But it's crucial to understand that those things are not the same. Those tokens are both tokens, but they are not the same token. And there's a bunch of problems that happen if you try to cheat a little bit and say, oh well, they're all authorization tokens, so why don't I just kind of use the same one twice? Very tempting. I was tempted to do it myself as well, and I was fortunately educated by some really smart folks in a number of GitHub threads to say, nope, can't do that. So I still see that. I think we should probably write a blog post together or something about that, because it's probably the number one confusion that I see people struggling with when they're building MCP servers is assuming that those tokens can be the same thing. And as long as you do validation on one, you've kind of validated them all, but not the case.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Good one here from Surash. Entra ID by default provides agent ID for agent built with AI Foundry. Curious if it's maybe something considered auth-N, auth-Z spec for MCP.
We are working very closely with the Entra ID team to make sure that their implementation actually fits well with the MCP specification. So stay tuned. No announcements today, but it's something that we are proactively working on, and we know it's something that we want to address.
You're not going to do a late-breaking announcement here, Dan?
No, this is not the announcement today. Today we're just learning from the community.
Oh, I thought you were about to drop something different.
No, not today.
All right, okay. What did we get over here? Sorry,
no, we didn't.
Just reach
What's this one?
on you here. Verified ID could assign a decentralized identifier and verifiable credentials to each agent or MCP host. Identity providers who trust ID issuer can then issue access tokens. It sounds like maybe that was a reply to someone else.
It could be, but it's true. I mean, here's the thing. The MCP specification defines the minimum bar. This is the least common denominator for folks to go and implement this, right? Like you can have a myriad of ways in which you can authorize your users to your server, your agent to your server, right? Like Nate and Wils, myself, we talked about this even outside this call. Like there's a million ways you can do this. So absolutely, distributed identity, also applicable.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time for questions. No, you know what? We do need to let Julia get set up, but we need to let these folks get on with their day. Yeah, get
out of here.
Go shift something we can announce that's huge.